Hello. We are going to finish this lesson about absolute values by graphing an absolute value function. So here is the most basic form of our absolute value. F of x equals the absolute value of x. Since this is, we're going to call it the parent function later, but since this is the most basic, we want to keep it centered around or know that it's centered around the origin. So I'm going to create this graph using a table of values. So I just chose numbers around the origin. So 2 to the left of the origin, 2 to the right. And then I plugged these x values in here to get my y values. So the absolute value of -2 is +2. Absolute value of -1 is +1. Absolute value of 0 is 0. So on and so forth. Okay, then I went ahead and plotted these points. When I plot them, they look like this. Absolute value functions are always in the shape of a V. So anytime you see absolute value bars, know that the graph will be a V. Like I mentioned earlier, this is what we call the parent function. It's the most basic. It's the simplest form of this function. But we can do some transformations that are going to change the shape or the position, the size of the graph. So we're going to start with an easy one. F of x equals 2 times the absolute value of x. Again, I'm going to choose points around the origin. So I create my xy table using these x values, and I plug these x values in. So absolute value of -2 is +2, and 2 times 2 is 4. Absolute value of -1 is 1, 2 times 1 is 2. 2 times 0 is 0, 2 times 1, 2 times 2 gives us those values. Here are those values plotted, still a V. This time, if you see, I sketched in the parent function very faintly. This seems to have gotten steeper. So this number out here, we're going to assume will make our graph steeper. Here is another equation. So we have absolute value of x plus 3. Because I know what this graph looks like, I chose some different x values. This time it's going to be not centered at the origin, but centered around -3. So when I plug in my values into my equation, I get these y values. I graphed, here is our equation, and then again I sketched in our parent function. So it appears to get from our parent function to this graph, we move to the left 3 units. So we're going to start learning how to pick up on these transformations based off of the equation. So this +3 means we move left 3 units. That leads us into our very generic form for absolute value. So to find our vertex, and by vertex I mean the turning point, that corner on our graph. This is our vertex where we change directions. Okay, so to find that vertex, we are always given an equation that looks something like that. The vertex will always come from H and K. So the H value is our X coordinate point, K is our Y coordinate point. So if we look at this last example that we just graphed, my H value here is a -3. Because notice in this general form, that was a minus. And in our example, it changed to a plus. So the only way to get it from minus to a plus is to make that H value negative, because then it would be minus negative, which turns into a positive. So our H value is -3. Our K value, we don't have anything added to the end, therefore it is 0. So our vertex was -3, 0. Here we have 2 absolute value of x minus 6 minus 2. Find the vertex. Well, we need to identify what are my H, my K values. H comes from right here. So our H value is 6. Our K value is -2. Therefore, our vertex is 6, -2. I'd like you guys to find the vertex of this g of x function.